Good evening to you all. My name is Juan Castaneda. I'm the director of the Vinson Center at the University of Buckingham. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to our seminar series, very much in collaboration with the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today, we have two excellent speakers. Steve Baker is going to start the presentation. It's going to be a joint presentation. Steve is a former minister in the Cabinet Office, and he's the chairman of the Fighting for a Free Future project. He's going to be followed by Max Rangeley. Max is the director of the Cobden Center. So we're going to do a presentation for 20 minutes each, followed by 20 minutes discussion with the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Juan, thank you. Juan, thank you very much indeed. And a huge thank you to the Vinson Center for hosting this evening, as of course a huge thank you to the IEA for hosting. Thank you all for being here. What a packed event. I didn't expect this. And it's a real privilege for me to be presenting this material to you. I think what we have to say tonight is important, far more important than is generally understood. This question, are we in the biggest bubble in history, is not retail politics today. But I think by the end of this evening, you will agree that it's going to be retail politics and public policy in the future. Some of you in the room, like me, might be old enough to remember the global financial crisis of 2008. And you will remember that Her Majesty the Queen asked, why did no one see this coming? And that was a very, very good question to the mainstream of economics professionals. If we're trying to land one thing tonight, achieve one thing, it's not to give you the solution to the problem we're about to lay out. It is to say we must have a paradigm shift in economic thought, because we are going to say to you that this is the biggest bubble in history. It is going to burst. And when it bursts, it is absolutely vital to our social system that the best economic brains correctly diagnose what has happened and come up with solutions which are appropriate. So, my job is to introduce to you the broad strategic context of where we are, and then Max will prove to you that this is the biggest bubble in history. So to start, this is a price index produced by the House of Commons Library and the Office for National Statistics around 2010. It is, of course, slightly out of date now, but the point is to show you the trajectory. If you look at that left-hand linear scale, a price index back to 1750 coming through to 2000, what you see is a flat line as money holds its value through the Industrial Revolution, a little inflation to get through the two world wars, and then something happens halfway between 1950 and 2000, and suddenly the value of money collapses. It wasn't that I was born in 1971. It was that Nixon closed the gold window, and under the Bretton Woods system, it was no longer possible to redeem the dollar in gold. And severing that last link between currency and a physical commodity of limited supply is the cause of that collapse in the value of money. Now, people fear depreciation in the current environment terribly. Now, I can see why. If depreciation follows from collapse in the money supply, there's a discussion to be had. But if you look at a log scale of what happened to prices in the Industrial Revolution, yeah, there were crises, there were perturbations, but the overall trend is downwards. This is really important. The Industrial Revolution was a time of profound improvement of condition of ordinary people. You could put a pound under the mattress in 1800 and it would have bought more in 1900, whereas you put a pound under the mattress the year I was born, it buys practically nothing in comparison today. So please hold this chart in your mind, because that pre-1971 monetary environment is categorically different to the environment after 71. What changed? This is the growth of the state. This is from the Taxpayers Alliance and David B. Smith. Before the First World War, this big spike this is government spending coming up. This is the private sector share of GDP coming down. So there's this big spike for the First World War, even bigger spike for the Second World War. Prior to the First World War, the dominant political economy was classical liberalism. The state was small. After the Second World War, it hasn't really mattered who's been in power. The state, including during the Thatcher years, there was some reduction, but the state has stayed up at this enormous level. A classical liberal era followed by a social democratic era. Does that make sense? 1971 is about there. So about this point here, the capacity of the monetary system to survive in the social democratic era came to an end. Let's just talk this through. Because this COVID experience, to me, is the absolute peak of what has been going on. If you look at this chart, this is from the Office for Budget Responsibility. The bars are the Debt Management Office's gilt issuance, complicated way of saying what the government needed to borrow to build a bridge through COVID. You remember we built a bridge to get through COVID, furlough and so forth. The diamonds are net asset purchase facility gilt purchases. Again, the posh language for saying money created. What happened during COVID is not that the government borrowed real resources from savers in order to redistribute them to pay for its policies. What happened is that the government borrowed money indirectly from the Bank of England creating it. The bond market knew, and I had this conversation with the governor at the time, the bond market knew it could expect the Bank of England to buy those bonds. They might be long-dated bonds, but the participants in the market take a short-term view. It's really important to know that we basically, colloquially, printed our way through COVID, so we shouldn't be surprised that we had a massive inflation afterwards. This is the heart of the issue. In an essay titled Gold and Economic Freedom, Alan Greenspan, later to become the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ron Paul asked him if he repudiated this argument. He never did. He wrote in Gold and Economic Freedom basically that the welfare state cannot survive other than by debasing the currency, because it isn't possible to tax people enough to meet the promises you've made. And so it is proving. This is the money supply. This is M4. If we publish the charts, you can get the exact series here. It would be tempting to look at this chart, which goes from 1997 here. The red is the period of Labour government to 2010, and then the blue is Conservative with the dark for the COVID years. So 97 to 2010. It'd be tempting to just look at the overall trend. Don't do that. It's really important that between 97 and 2010, the money supply tripled. The amount of money in the UK tripled from 700 billion to about 2.2 trillion. People say that money is neutral. I want you to imagine a UK-shaped fish tank with an inch of water in it. And you get a big jug of water and you pour water until it's 3 inches. Now, if money was neutral, it'd be like water flowing evenly everywhere all at once. But imagine it's actually black treacle. And if you create money by lending it into existence, which is how it's done, or QE, and it's black treacle, and you've got an inch of black treacle, and then you pour the volume necessary to get to 3 inches, you pour that volume over London, the city of London, you're going to get a big pile of black treacle over the city of London because it takes time to spread out and pass hand to hand. Does that make sense? Money is not neutral. So that tripling will have effects which we'll come to in the next slide. In a sense, this talk is one of discontinuities because this monetary environment in the years of the first parliament where I was an MP, this is a categorically different monetary environment here. You can't just average this away in a trend line, a tripling, then a stagnation. Hayek wrote about this, spoke about this in his Nobel lecture, that employment sustained by increases in the money supply can only be sustained for as long as the increases continue, or for perhaps only as long as they continue to accelerate. And there it is. It is not as if the literature isn't there to explain what is going on. You then get a big boost in the money supply through COVID and then a bit more stagnation. You can't aggregate away this just through trend lines. Here's a couple of examples of why this matters. On the left, house prices split out by regions. That's why I was talking about the black treacle and the time it takes for money to spread out. The median is in the yellow, but if you dug into this chart, which was from the Bank of England, the high house price increases are London, and the low house prices increases are the north of England and Scotland. These are called Cantillon effects. When money is created, the benefits go to the first recipients before the prices are bid up. If money is created by banks lending it into existence in the financial system, don't be surprised that house prices soar in London first and Scotland and the north last. I'm going through this fairly fast because I want to create the context for Max, but there's a paper I've written, there's 15,000 words going through this in the supporting literature, which I hope you'll read when it's published. This one is taken from the government's own budget red book. Everybody puzzles about the productivity difficulties we've had since the global financial crisis, but there it is. 2008, trend productivity, again, another discontinuity. But you'll remember what I showed you with the money supply. The global financial crisis hits, and then we've got a categorically different monetary environment. I'm not going to try to explain what's going on here. I mean to just provoke you to consider, might it be that this massive stagnation in productivity gains is related to the global financial crisis, that there's some kind of cause and effect between apparent, and I do say apparent, productivity gains in the maths, in that during that tripling of the money supply, and what happens subsequently. This is hitting real people. I was going to come to it later. We've got a great realignment in politics going on. Steve is here. He's written a brilliant book. You must read it. Nationalism is now the dominant political axis, not the economy. And yet, as Steve said when he was up here, it could well be that economic factors have caused that nationalist realignment. This is serious, as I'll come back to in the conclusion. House prices. When I first got into politics, you could talk to young people about freedom in the abstract, and it would land. But now you can't talk to young people until you've talked about housing. I think young people would probably vote for tyranny if they got a house. Right, but look at house prices. This is from pricedingold.com. The green line, and this is a log scale, so of course that line's shooting away off through the ceiling. The green line is in pounds. The blue line is houses in the UK priced in gold. Yes, lots of volatility, but house prices today in gold are about the same as they were in 1955. This should be an emperor's new clothes moment. What is going on that so few people can see? That so much damage is being done to real people's lives by our monetary environment. And the reason for that monetary environment is to meet deficit spending of the welfare state as Greenspan set out. Where does all this go? The chart on the left is from the Office for Budget Responsibility. The green line is total government spending. There's a short-run forecast shaded, and then it's the long run. Taxation, revenues is yellow. So the OBR forecasts that revenues will be stagnant while spending soars away. Why age-related spending? Here, this is a chart from 2010, but it's to illustrate that whether you look at Austria, France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, the United Kingdom, or the United States, this is debt to GDP. They've all got the same problem, crystallizing today that we cannot afford the pledges of the welfare state. For 50 years, chronic deficit spending has ultimately been covered by debasing the currency. Alan Greenspan said it. This is not really Steve Baker saying it. It's Alan Greenspan that pointed it out. And that is what is going on. We've ended up debasing the currency in the biggest bubble in history in order to sustain our social system. Max is now going to prove to you that it is in fact the biggest bubble in history. And I've been asked to say, Max, we need to stay behind the lectern to stay on the camera.
Thank you, Steve. And so, yes, in order to understand how we got into this situation that we're currently in, with house prices out of reach of the vast majority of young people, stock markets in a bubble, pretty much every asset class in a bubble, it's important to understand this did not just take place following COVID in the last 5-6 years, or even the last 10 or 15 years. In fact, this bubble has been building up for about the last 40 years or so now. So what we've seen from roughly the late 1980s onwards is that with each recession, not just in Britain, but across the developed world, with each recession, central banks have responded by setting lower and lower interest rates, and thereby creating a series of larger and larger debt bubbles. So if we take the USA, for instance, with Alan Greenspan, as Steve mentioned, when the bubbles of the late 1980s burst, in the early 90s, Greenspan set interest rates at 3%. That was the lowest for decades. And that combined with the Greenspan put during the 1990s, then created an even larger bubble. That was the dot-com bubble. Then when the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, the response was even lower interest rates of 1%. And that then created an even larger bubble, which was the housing bubble. Then when that burst in 2008, the response was, again, even lower interest rates, years of 0% interest rates. And that created, in fact, a far larger bubble. So in 2008, around the time of the financial crisis, total global debt was around $150 trillion. Yet after years of 0% interest rates, it reached more than $300 trillion. It is now somewhere around, I think, $340 trillion. In other words, far from bringing about a return to prosperity, what central bank policies like 0% interest rates and QE have done is to essentially double the size of the global debt bubble following the 2008 financial crisis. So here we see that's interest rates from the 1980s onwards. So this is in the USA. So you can see this series of lower and lower interest rates, which has been creating larger and larger debt bubbles. But again, other central banks have joined in. This, for instance, is the European Central Bank. Of course, it came into being around the year 2000, and they followed this trend pattern as well. This is one of the first consequences of this, is the huge increase in debt. So you can see from this period of the 1980s onwards, with each phase of these lower and lower interest rates, it's just been pumping more and more debt into the system. But the consequences actually go well beyond just debt. So here we see in yellow the interest rates. In blue, we have saving. In red, we have debt. This is for the USA again. So you can see with each phase of lower interest rates, it's pumping more and more debt into the system. But you also have lower and lower rates of savings. Now, this is a sign of a bubble along the lines of what Friedrich von Hayek would predict, the Nobel Prize-winning economist. Essentially, if we were to boil down Friedrich von Hayek's theory of the business cycle, it's that interest rates are a pricing mechanism, just like the price of coffee or the price of butter or anything else. Now, if we take the price of coffee, if there's a shortage of coffee, the price goes up. And that incentivizes producers to bring more coffee to market. It disincentivizes people from consuming too much. If a government steps in and then fixes the price of coffee artificially low, it disturbs that mechanism. It sells false price signals to the market. So people consume too much. You end up with shortages and people don't produce as much as they should. It's a similar thing with interest rates. When you have a debt bubble, when central banks then step in and set even lower interest rates, what you have is this situation. So in a genuine free market where interest rates are set by the market, if people saved more, then that would bring down interest rates as there's a larger pool of savings available. If more people want to borrow money, that pushes up interest rates, which disincentivizes borrowing and encourages more saving. So in other words, interest rates are a pricing mechanism, just like the price of coffee or butter or anything else. And when central banks intervene and start setting interest rates, they disturb this pricing mechanism. And this is what you end up with. But what you also end up with is asset bubbles. So this, Steve touched on housing. This is the total amount of assets in the economy relative to GDP. Housing, stocks, crypto, classic cars, really everything rolled into one. So you can again see from the 1980s, with each phase of lower and lower interest rates, it pushes this asset bubble up higher and higher. And you can see each time, for instance, after the 2008 crisis, when the total value of assets came down, that was actually at the beginning of a healthy process of housing prices and asset values coming back down to normal levels. But of course, the response was 0% interest rates and then creating an even larger bubble. And here we see, as in the US, we see the phase of lower and lower interest rates then creating larger and larger asset bubbles over the last 40 years or so. And we'll go a bit deeper into some of these asset classes. So this is stocks. This is the Shiller PE ratio, a good metric for stock market bubbles. You'll see several of the peaks are higher than even 1929. This goes back to the mid-19th century. What's also interesting is if you look at the red line, that's the average PE ratio for each decade. You'll see that the average PE ratio in every decade during this bubble period is higher than any decade in all of recorded history since this data set starts in the 19th century. This is the buffer indicator, another metric for stock market bubbles, essentially the size of the stock market relative to the economy. And we see again this going up. You'll see actually around 2005 or so, it doesn't quite go up as high as the other peaks. Yet there was, of course, a huge credit bubble during that period. That's because a lot of the credit went into housing, of course, which then burst in 2008. But then when we moved to 0% interest rates, it sets it off again. This is Tobin's Q, another metric for stock market bubbles. Again, you can see the red line. The average for every decade during this bubble period is higher than any decade since records began. These metrics are stock market bubbles, though. What this is being driven by, as you probably guessed, is to a large extent debt. And so here what we see is margin debt. So that's people essentially borrowing money to invest in the stock market. And you can see with each phase of lower interest rates, it's pumping more and more debt into the stock market to inflate these larger and larger bubbles. And this is margin debt relative to market cap. So so you saw the buffer indicator, for instance. You saw how large market cap is relative to GDP. And this is how much of that is being fueled by credit. So you can see with each phase of the growth of the bubble, it requires more and more debt to inflate the bubble even larger. And what we did for this book is we created an indicator for stock market bubbles, what you might call a Hayekian indicator. So this is a composite index of the buffer indicator and margin debt to market cap. So what is that? Okay, briefly, that is how big is the stock market relative to the economy and how much of the stock market is being inflated with debt. So that's a composite indicator which gives you an idea of the level of debt-fueled stock market bubble that we're in. And in the red line, you see interest rates. So you see as interest rates fall and fall, you see we're in more and more of this debt-fueled stock market bubble. This is house prices, which is, of course, following the same pattern. House prices in the blue line is average earnings. This is in the UK. So we see with each phase of lower interest rates, it's pumping house prices higher and higher relative to average incomes. So similar to what we saw for stock markets. This, of course, has significant social consequences if young people can't afford to buy housing. And here we see in the red line, we have real estate loans, and in the blue line, commercial and industrial loans. So effectively, people borrowing money for something productive to build things and invent things versus just speculating on housing. And we see during this bubble period, they go completely out of control, and so much more credit is going on real estate speculation rather than industrial loans. And then we move on to bonds, which really is a critical area for understanding this bubble. And so as interest rates have fallen, we see the Fed funds rate there, we see the quality of bonds also falling. So as more and more debt is created, the debt is actually worse and worse quality. So most famously in recent years, there was, of course, the so-called subprime mortgages of the 2008 crisis. That was very low quality debt, essentially giving mortgages to people where there was no way they were going to afford it. The debt now is really far lower quality than it was at the time of the 2008 crisis. Not only have they essentially doubled the size of the global debt bubble, but actually the debt now is far lower quality. It's consumer debt, credit card debt, corporate debt is very low quality, which we'll come to. And so you can see with each phase of lower interest rates, that's what's been driving this lower and lower quality in debt. And here we see investment grade bonds. So what's this? Investment grade bonds would be bond portfolios that you might see, for instance, in pension funds. And you'll see the BBB bonds. That's the blue line. So that's the lowest quality bonds allowed in a pension fund, for instance. Those should make up a small percentage of someone's pension fund. As you can see, they're maybe 5 to 10%, something like that. But as interest rates have fallen and bond quality has gone down, you see that actually around 2020, BBB bonds, the lowest quality bonds allowed in a investment grade portfolio, actually outnumbered all other bonds put together. So this is your pension fund. If you think the subprime mortgage bonds of the 2008 crisis were bad, again, this is measurably far worse. This is the lowest quality bonds filling up people's investment grade bond portfolios, whether it's in pension funds or anything else. And so we were looking at different metrics for the bond bubble. What we wanted to do was create something like the P ratio, but for bonds. And I found this data. This is from two professors at Harvard called Greenwood and Hansen. And the blue line is non-investment grade bonds as a share of the total bond market. And the red line is the default rate of bonds. So you can see you have all these low quality bonds coming into the market. Then the default rate spikes. And then you go back to this same cycle. They flow like this. So what we did is I took this data and again, we wanted to create something like the P ratio for bonds. So what the bond risk ratio is, it's essentially high quality bonds divided by low quality bonds. And this is from 60,700 bond issuances across 105 different countries. So this is a metric of the global bond bubble. And you can see, again, just by taking high quality bonds and dividing it by the amount of low quality bonds in the market, you can see it being pumped up over time. So this is the amount of risk that has been building up in bond markets over the last generation or so. And as we move on then, here we see delinquency rates. This is in the USA this time. So that's the number of companies getting into difficulties in recessions. And you see as interest rates come down, delinquency rates come down as well. So a central banker or someone at the IMF may look at that and say, well, look at how successful we've been. We've been cutting interest rates, and so fewer and fewer companies are getting into difficulties. So that means unemployment doesn't increase and so on. So they would regard this as a great success. But actually the next graph shows almost a mirror image of this, and that is the number of zombie companies across 14 economies. So what they're doing is essentially preserving zombie companies. Zombie companies should be less than 5% of the economy, realistically. You can see, even in the 1980s, it was around 5%. This is for 14 economies. And up there, it's getting close to 1 in 5 businesses are zombie companies. Zombie companies essentially not doing anything productive. They're struggling just to pay the interest on their debt and so on. So it's just essentially a metric for completely unproductive businesses just limping along. So those types of businesses should go bust in recessions, and those resources are then freed up for productive parts of the economy. But that's not been happening. So that's the reason, one of the reasons why we have this chronic stagnation across much of the developed world. Essentially, we've been for 20 years or more now with no increase in living standards for most people. And so what we wanted to do was then create a metric to look at this aspect of stagnation. So I created the Economic Performance Index, which takes asset turnover ratio, return on assets, and return on equity, and puts them together into a composite index. And you can see this falling over time. Now, the reason I wanted to do it like this is to look at the marginal productivity of debt. So with all of this debt coming into the economy, some people might say, well, surely this debt is being used productively. Companies are investing, they're creating jobs. But what we see here is actually productivity going down over time. Now, one of the ways people have looked at the marginal productivity of debt is using GDP. So you look at how much debt has increased in any particular year, and then you look at how much GDP increases in that year or the following 1 or 2 years. The problem with that is that a lot of these companies, especially, first of all, you have companies borrowing money and then just buying Ferraris for the directors. Of course, that increases GDP. But also, conversely, you have consumers just going out and spending money on their credit card, and that also increases GDP. But that's all debt that needs to be paid back. So that's why we use this metric rather than just looking at the marginal productivity of debt in terms of GDP. And this is those same businesses, tens of thousands of businesses, the Economic Performance Index relative to the amount of debt on the balance sheets of those companies. So you can see as debt goes up, productivity goes down. So this debt is not being used productively by these businesses. So in other words, we're in a massive corporate debt bubble, as well as government debt and consumer debt and everything else. Now, what this does is it takes the previous page and just creates a ratio. So it's the Economic Performance Index divided by the debt for all of those businesses. So you can start to see the marginal productivity of debt for all of these businesses. And you see it going down over time quite drastically. But you may say then, well, what do central banks have to do with this? Well, central banks will obviously claim 0% interest rates or even negative interest rates, and QE allows companies to borrow lots of money so that they invest. Now, if you think about this from a practical perspective for a moment, imagine if you're a big company like Siemens or something. In the Eurozone, they actually had negative interest rates. Here we had 0% interest rates. So imagine you're a big company like Siemens, and you can issue hundreds of millions of euros of bonds at negative interest rates, which are then just sold directly to the European Central Bank. So you have all of this hundreds of millions of euros of cash on your balance sheet. Do you think that's going to incentivize you to actually innovate? Of course not. So central bankers, when they go on the news and they say, "Oh yes, all of this debt is so that companies can invest and create jobs," actually it does the opposite. It creates more stagnation, and that's what we see here. So this is that previous graph, but in the red we see the European Central Bank balance sheet, which bought many trillions of euros of corporate bonds during this time. So you can see as the European Central Bank intervenes more in the market and buys more and more bonds from corporations, it just makes the stagnation and malinvestment even more entrenched. It gets worse and worse with each phase of bond buying over time. And obviously, central bankers will still talk this way. They'll still talk about how, oh, we saved the economy by buying all of these bonds with QE and so on. Again, Steve, you'll notice some of these are huge data sets, which we got from the OECD and elsewhere. Quite a lot of them end around 2020. So I thought it's useful to also address the post-COVID era specifically. And what we've seen is something even more drastic. So that is the Federal Reserve in the US, the Federal Reserve balance sheet. And so huge amounts of money was printed during COVID. And then this is that total assets relative to GDP that we saw earlier. And again, we see it's even higher now. So it's getting almost impossible for young people to buy houses. Stock markets are at the highest valuations in history by pretty much all the metrics that we looked at. So just about everything is now part of this asset bubble as a result of all of this money creation. And it's also worth noting, people often say that the consequence of all of this money creation during COVID was inflation. Of course there was inflation. Of course we're all paying more for things in the shops. But actually this kind of stuff is actually more damaging than inflation. We've seen when all of this money is created, if it flows into bond markets, it causes actually those distortions will be far worse for the economy than if they just printed some money and the prices went up in the shops. Annoying though that is, when prices go up in the shops, these other effects that we've looked at today are actually far worse than just regular consumer price inflation. And so, Steve, I think you'd like to say something to conclude.
Max, yeah, thanks very much. I believe that Max and I have shown you using data, using evidence, and using reason that we are in the biggest bubble in history. That the reason that I've said at the beginning that this is important is this. We know what bubbles do. They burst. If it's the biggest bubble in history, you would expect, if the distortions sown by it have been worse than they were at the time of the global financial crisis, you would expect the aftermath to be even worse than it was during the global financial crisis. I think it's really important to take a moment and think about the context. We already have a great realignment in politics towards nationalism. Nationalism tends to beget economic interventionism, both at home and overseas. When economic interventionism takes place overseas, it tends to result in great power competition. What do you see in the world today? The President of the United States and his tariff policies, great power contests between China and Russia and the USA, a tendency to blame migrant populations. I don't think I need to draw you much more of a picture of where this could go. The thing that worries me most about this situation, the thing which has worried me most since I first got into politics, is that economists don't see things this way. Let no one say when this bubble bursts, no one saw it coming. What we need to do before it bursts is persuade economists to start thinking differently about knowledge, epistemology, to think differently about method, how they apply mathematics, and to think differently about knowledge, knowledge, time, method. Time. Production takes time. We must have a paradigm shift in economic thought if we're to cope with this. So, Hayekian Bayesian analysis does allow us to understand the situation we're in. It's a 40-year inflation, but it will probably burst very suddenly. It is unprecedented in its scope and in its size. And it is vitally important that all of us play our part in making the change. And that's actually why I'm encouraged and why I give you reason for hope. 3 reasons. 1, gold is being remonetized. I personally use Glint. I'm an investor in Glint. There are other applications like Tally, but anyone can now own and save and spend real physical gold. 2nd, Bitcoin. And if you go to satsversusfiat.com, you'll find a brilliant video which spells out for anyone the consequences of this chronically inflationary monetary system. And the 3rd reason that I'm hopeful, actually, honestly, it's all of you sitting here still paying attention after all this time. To see this room packed, for me personally, is very moving and one of the most important things that's happened in all of my time in public life. And you'll know some of the things that I've done. It's important because we're in such a mess, a bigger mess than anyone realizes. I said at the beginning that this is not retail politics and public policy and news, but it will be. And when it is, all of you in this room, some especially, will have a really important role to play in pointing out that it is not free markets that failed, that immigrants are not to blame, that actually we did this to ourselves. With that, we'll take any questions.
Well, thank you both very much. So we have 20 minutes to close the session. So any comments, please? Any questions at the back?
I agree with pretty much everything you said. But why don't entrepreneurs and intelligent people realize that the interest rate is artificially low when the government sets it, such that they correct their behavior so they don't invest in things which are going to go bust when the interest rate inevitably goes up to correct for inflation?
Do you know, when I'm at home, when my wife asks me questions, I always say to her, that's a really interesting question. I'm glad you asked me that. And she always knows it's the beginning of a very long answer. The fundamental issue is this, is that economists ought to have more to add to the sum of human knowledge than the ordinary person of business. Otherwise, what's the point being an economist? And this is a point that Hayek made himself. Normal people go about their everyday life and have to take certain things for granted. If you're in the business of building houses, you're in the business of building houses, and the cost of money to borrow is one of your input prices. You can't really be expected to have run a comparative macroeconomic analysis across different frameworks to work out it's not a good idea. In a sense, it's musical chairs and everyone's dancing. And you've just got to go with the context in which you work. And that's why all of you are important, because you are all people who are paying attention to this. Just one illustration of where this goes wrong. The word capital is used in business, I've found time and again, to actually mean cash in the bank that can be used to buy things, keep the business going. That's not what Hayek and Mises meant by capital. They meant the sum of all accumulated wealth, which could be put to purposes. And we've got a real problem with terms, with knowledge, with economics. And actually the reason that entrepreneurs make the mistake is you just can't do everything. You have to operate within the context that you have.
So, Steve, I need to ask Bruno, please.
Yeah, that's like I agree with all I saw that, not surprisingly. I think there's a slight transmission mechanism missing. So Max, you mentioned about how the availability of credit to companies would be a deterrent to investment. Well, passively, it's the opposite. If you can borrow cheap money, you can easily buy machines rather than using labor. And so there's a need to explain why that would happen. I was just, there's a number of factors. One is actual innovation less often comes from the big companies who had access to these very low interest rates. They're much more in the business of driving down margin, economies of scale. If you're doing something really quite risky, it's more commonly entrepreneurs who very often have to rely on private capital because lenders will not lend to things unproven and by companies who are not as big. There's an element of that. You've also got availability of labour. So it just unfortunately happened to coincide that this very cheap interest was available at a time when also a lot of cheap labour was available. So if you're a small business thinking, shall I innovate? Well, you face competition from people who can borrow for almost nothing, which means you're likely to be competed into the ground. Your safest option for your own capital, for which you need a decent return, because when you take whiskey bets, you need a decent. Your safest option is to use labour if it's available cheap. So I think there's a number of factors that you need, or we just say cheap debt means low productivity. It's not obviously a causal effect. It's actually bad for class.
Any comment?
Yes. So that is looking at large companies, not small businesses. I think it is the case with large businesses. If they essentially, I don't even know if you would call it cheap debt. It was negative interest rate debt in the Eurozone. It's essentially free money. And I think that's been a significant disincentive for them to really innovate. What you say is exactly right with small businesses. Most innovation comes from small businesses, and that's where that ties into the zombie companies that I talked about. That was BIS statistics of whatever it was, 14 or 15 major economies. And we were up to the point where almost 1 in 5, I think that's public companies they were looking at, is a zombie company. Now, they are hogging resources that can be used elsewhere. Like you, I run a business. We do engineering and it's a tech company. So I want to hire engineers. That's more difficult if all of these large zombie companies are just borrowing money for nothing and hoovering up all of the engineers. Then on top of that, we're a little restricted. There's more in the book that we wrote. And I should say for anybody here, this book that we wrote, we give away for free. If you just type in, are we in the largest bubble in history, Steve Baker, Max Rangeley, you'll find it online. And we go deeper into a lot of this data. And one of the things we actually talk about and show some graphs is as interest rates fall, more and more higher share of the bonds come from large companies, come from incumbents versus small businesses. So that's clearly the case. And then one other factor here, just adding to this, is during these credit bubbles, is the number of people with especially advanced training, PhDs in physics and engineering, who go and work in finance. And before this credit bubble, that was something very unusual or pretty much unheard of. Whereas we have a whole section in the book where we talk about this, using a lot of data, how essentially with each phase of this bubble, you have a higher and higher percentage of PhDs in physics and engineering going to work in the city or on Wall Street for investment banks. And of course, that's a huge malinvestment. In Hayekian economics, they often talk about malinvestment in terms of industrial production. It's quite a 20th century approach. But of course, these days, human capital is the most important form of capital. And I actually think that may well be the most damaging of all, because we've got all of these scientists who should be doing something productive, who should be building things and making things, who are just going to work in finance, just packaging up derivatives or something.
And Max, may I follow that up? To what extent the increase in the amount of money in the Eurozone, in the US, in the UK as well, right before the global financial crisis from 2002 to 2007 was very much a result of the application of flawed inflation targeting rules? Because as you explained in the diagram, during the 19th century, the economy was growing. There was indeed productivity growth. And with that, we had the declining pattern in inflation. That's the reason why, that's the result of the Bank of England at the time not offsetting that trend in the market by printing more money.
Can I let Max a moment to think of something clever to say? I'm always reminded of Nelson in this conversation. I see no ships. But they weren't looking at the price of houses to buy. And after the global financial crisis, they introduced something called CPIH, Consumer Prices Housing, which included owner-occupiers' housing costs. Didn't include the actual asset price of the house as it soars away. And it's easy to get inflation targeting wrong if you don't include in your inflation target those prices which are soaring as a result of your policy. And it's It's kind of crazy, but that's why I talk about the need to think about method and knowledge and time. Because all the time economists are saying, I see no ships. Well, funny enough, they didn't see the ships sailing over the edge of the ocean, you know.
And that's exactly right what you said, Juan. When a lot of money is being created, generally in the form of debt, many economists will look at stable prices and say, well, there isn't much inflation in the economy, therefore there's not a problem. This is actually what happened in the 1920s as well. Economists like Irving Fisher saw that the price levels in the economy were stable, yet actually huge amounts of debt were being created. There was obviously stock market bubbles, there was housing bubbles also during the 1920s, and that eventually burst in 1929. We saw a similar thing, especially during the 1990s, where there was very low inflation, but huge amounts of debt, huge amounts of credit was being created. And of course, that burst in 2000, which was a similar scenario to 1929, actually. But then, of course, what then happened is they look back at what happened. It's as if they looked at what happened in 1929 and thought, you know what they really should have done then was actually just doubled down and created an even larger bubble. And that's what happens. So as I touched on at the end there, when lots of debt and lots of money are created, price inflation is not the most damaging thing. I know it's annoying for us all to go to the shops and have the price of everything going up over time, but actually what you should be really worried about is if there's lots of debt being created, but prices are not going up in the shops. Because then you have to ask yourself, well, where is all of this money going? Wherever this money is flowing to, that's where you have a bubble. And that bubble will then start pulling in resources into that sector. So if it's housing leading up to the 2008 crisis or whatever else, so that can be far more damaging.
Thank you. Please.
Thanks. Two-part question. First for Max, you're obsessed with interest rates. I'm obsessed with birth rates. It's fascinating that in 1970, birth rates collapsed across the world, whether they were high to start with or low. Every single country in the world that you can measure, birth rate starts to fall. Do you think there's a link between money printing, debt, collapse of the gold standard, and a lack of confidence in the future across the world?
Yeah.
And then Steve, at the end of your speech, you said this is not retail politics. Again, that's the same with birth rates, and yet it is one of the biggest threats to our future. How do we make this retail politics? How do we convince a, frankly, desensitized population that actually these are the big issues that they should be concerned about? And in a market where public opinion is all that counts, how do we change public opinion?
Please, sure, I can ask. Yes.
So, yes, all of the graphs that we looked at today have knock-on effects. And a classic one is demographics and birth rates. So with house prices as high as they are, inflated by all of this debt, it actually significantly depresses birth rates. Funnily enough, we saw this, Japan went through a lot of what we're going through a generation earlier. They had a huge bubble in the late 1980s caused by very low interest rates. It burst in the early 1990s, and the response was very low interest rates and QE. And they saw many of the same things. They had demographic collapse starting a generation before us. But of course, now what we see in pretty much every country that's part of this credit bubble is very low birth rates. There is, of course, a correlation between young people becoming homeowners and birth rates. Everyone understands that informally, but there's also been some reasonably good analysis looking at this more rigorously. We can see it quite clearly in the data. So yes, that's just another knock-on effect of all of this, really. And it's obviously tragic for all the young people that can't afford houses as well.
There's a great book by your Guido Husman called The Ethics of Money Production. He's a good Catholic and he talks about some of these issues, but I think it's absolutely the case that poor quality money creates circumstances in which people are demoralized. How can you possibly be hopeful for the future if you can't buy a family home on median wages? And people should be able to buy a family home and start a family. And it's really scandalous. How to make this popular? I've been talking about this for 16 years now. This is the biggest audience, probably with the exception of some Conservative Party audiences, but we've just got to keep talking to people. And I think with the birth rates as well, one of the things we have to do is brilliant that you're on the TV, Miriam, if I may say so, and able to directly put the issues out there. But journalism will run on short-term cycles. There are basically 5 categories of news story. Scandal, danger to the community, novelty, human interest, and the sport. Yeah. Danger, scandal, novelty, human interest. So one of the best things I did while I was